let it run for just like 2 minutes, you know.
There we
Oh,
are.
we've just gone live. There we go. The stream is live. It's there. We're gonna let it run for a couple of minutes, let people get in the door. But this is being recorded, so I should probably get it rolling a little bit for people who listen later. My name is Oliver Brackenbury. I am the publisher of New Edge Sword and Sorcery magazine, which is now birthing its very first book, the very first title for the cleverly named Brackenbury books, imprinting company, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, Beating Hearts and Battle Axes, a spicy, romantic, infused sword and sorcery anthology. First volume of many? Let's find out. But in the meanwhile, let's focus on the first one. And that first one is being edited by Jay Wolf, who is here with me now. And I will let introduce themselves.
Hi, I am Jay Wolf, editor and bon vivant. The I'm trying to think of I had a good line here, and it's too early. I'm not adequately caffeinated for this.
It's all right. You just have to
This is
sound
the thing you do
knowledgeable
to
about editing.
freelancers in this life. There's two modes for freelancing. You get up at 5 or you get up at whenever. um But yeah, so I am the editor on Beating Hearts and Battle Axes. I am a longtime lover of all things sword and sorcery, and I am very happy to be here.
Yeah. And you see we're starting to get some people in the chat. Hello, Javier. So we have a bunch of questions ripped from the New Edge Sword and Sorcery Discord. And we're just going to work through them. I know Jay maybe has a question or two specifically for me. I think I asked you, Jay, all the specific questions I would have been editing maybe when we did the opening launch live stream. But if I
I
think of
think that
something
that's
I
quite
haven't,
possible.
yeah, if I think of something I didn't cover earlier, I'll throw it out there. But yeah, so we have a bunch of questions all ready to go. That being said, those of you in the chat, please feel free to chuck stuff at us as we're going along if you think of anything else you would like to know about. All right, so I'm going to do that thing where I look like I'm not paying attention, but I'm opening a Word file.
Yes.
Okay.
No worries.
So I think what we'll do is, Jay, I'll read the question, and then you give me your answer first, and then I'll give my answer, and then new question.
Sounds good.
So, with the little preamble that I am using people's Discord usernames, so some of these may sound less than what you'd have on your driver's license. Alden, the largest duck. Just let's let that sink in. Alden, the largest duck, bless you, asks, "What are some instant turnoff you see in submissions, and have you ever changed your mind on one in a given submission?"
Oh, that's such a good question. So the answer is that there are a bunch of turnoffs, and none of them are anything that I could possibly explain in terms of like, oh, I'm definitely not going to really want to finish reading this. In general, I try to be as open-minded as possible when I am reading for what we in the industry call slush. I've been a slush reader at Uncanny Magazine since the year 2014, so it's been a long time. And I have read literally thousands of stories in that period of time. I've done slush for a couple of other opportunities as well. I most notably for this year's Viable Paradise class, I read just about everything that came in and commented on the ones that I was asked to comment on. So in terms of like what I'm like looking for or not looking for in slush, it's almost impossible to say. So one of the things that I do when I'm reading slush is I read twice. I will read a story for the first time. I will try and kind of just muscle through as much of it as I possibly can. And there's usually like a little gut check moment, like, do I really want to read the rest of this? And sometimes what I'll do at that point is flip to the end and see if they nailed the landing on the ending of the story. And if I can sort of see the thread from the first part of the story that I read and the ending, it kind of goes into my maybe pile at that point, because that's already just like, okay, that much has been threaded. But in general, what I do, whether I like a submission or not, whether I enjoy reading it or not, I almost always give it 2 shots, because your gut reaction to a story is almost always, I hesitate to call it like the wrong one, but it's like it's an impulse as much as anything else. And so the knee-jerk reaction, you have to sort of like fight back a little bit and say like, okay, but are you reacting to this, or are you reacting to the fact that you had like a hot pocket for lunch like 6 hours ago and you're very hungry right now? Like, what are you responding to? Are you responding to the story, or are you responding to like external stimuli in your own life? And if you experience that, like the first time you read it, that's one thing. If you experience the like ooh feeling the second time you read it, it's usually not just your environment. So that's why I try to break it up. What I'll usually do is read it at night and then I might read the following afternoon. Like give myself time and space to like think about something. How about you, Oliver?
Yeah, I think that's really smart. Like, I think that's when you're doing your own writing or almost anything else, if your mood is kind of like bad when you're doing, reading a draft of something yours or someone else's, definitely
Mhm.
check like, am I hungry? Is it
Yep.
gas? Is it
Yep.
gas? You know,
You have to do the whole
but
checklist of like, what am I feeling right now?
yeah, it's not fair to dismiss someone's story just because like you're in a foul mood because the dog did something or whatever.
Right.
And I've definitely received rejections that felt like that's what happened.
Yeah, and
You
that's
just get, like,
that's
the
why
real.
I try to avoid it.
Yeah, yeah. But to the question, as far as instant turn-offs you've seen submissions, I haven't done a heck of a lot of slush reading. I've been doing mainly commissions so far in my publishing journey, but we did do the flash fic little sub drive earlier, and I also I just know myself and how I would feel like going forward to when we do more open submissions for the
Yeah.
magazine anthologies and so forth.
Yeah.
I mean, anything aside from really obvious stuff, by which I mean, like, I don't know, they send me a chapter of the Turner Diaries or it's Garfield fanfic, like, aside from stuff that's just, like, marvelously off base,
Yeah.
in which case, yeah, life's too short, I'm not reading that. I would say things that, like, willfully defy the submission guidelines. I know some people think that can be really radical and interesting. I find that undisciplined and irritating. So, I don't
Yeah.
mean that you, like, like, it's like if I say, like, "Please write me a sword and sorcery story," and they send in, like, cozy fantasy, but it's got a barbarian in it. I'm like, "That's nice, but it's not what I'm looking for." And you have to be, like, so good, and be doing something so interesting, and I have to be in the mood for that,
Right.
right? Which is a next factor nobody has control over, no matter how talented they are,
Right.
to really, like, willfully, like, defy what I asked for and
Yeah.
expect me to be like, "Oh my goodness, they're reinventing the medium." Now this may sound obvious, but over the Jay, I think how many times have you said to me that like when you put up sub guidelines, there's a certain kind of writer that triggers their
Oh, yeah.
desire to be
Oh,
contrary.
yeah, the more specific you are in your sub guidelines, the more specifically some people will attack them. And
Yeah,
so for me, like, I mean, the other thing that you have, which is interesting, is that you have a subgenre definition. So,
yeah,
like, when I read for Uncanny is like a very wide purview. Same thing with Viable Paradise. Like, the Viable Paradise guidelines are send us a thing. It
yeah,
should be about this size. It should probably be fantasy or science fiction because that's what we do. But
yeah,
like beyond that, there's not really any scoping in on the ones that I have read for it. And then like now the other one of the anthologies that I've worked on that ultimately never came to fruition had a really specific purview, and the purview was also like almost impossible to penetrate in terms of like, oh, well, what does this mean? And so like we sort of had to just sort of take in what people wanted to throw at us for the prompt being speculative masculinity. So like what does that mean? Like
yeah,
and we got a wide range of stuff that was really like freaking fascinating, but we couldn't define it any more than that without losing some of the numinous quality. And
mm,
so like that was sort of challenging. Everything else I've read for has been essentially an open spec. So comparing that to like New Edge Sword and Sorcery, where you have two actual like real specific things that you want, which is kind of
yeah,
great because it narrows your field a lot. Being that you want sword and sorcery stories and you want sword and sorcery stories that reflect a classic view with slightly more modern viewpoints, um,
But yeah. Just like, and
among
this is
other
where I
things.
appreciate that what I asked for maybe sounds very difficult because I'm like I want to recognize sword and sorcery, but I also want to see people trying to like push things a bit.
Yeah,
So
you're
like,
you're
are
you're
those in
asking for an
conflict?
elevation.
Well, yeah, like, and are those 2 points in conflict? Well, that's a whole conversation that I have
Oh yeah,
filled,
we can talk about
podcasts,
that for
but
a whole hour by itself.
yeah, so I'll just say to wrap up this question, yeah, like I say, just what I consider to be a lack of discipline in attending to what I've asked for. If someone orders it, and if that sounds really strict and mean or whatever, just imagine that you go to a restaurant, you order a hamburger, and they give you tricycle. Like, it's just, how would you feel? How have you felt when you've gotten, and so, yeah. But of course, the reason I started to sound sweaty in this is because I also don't want to discourage people from experimentation. So, have I ever received anything and kicked it out the window because it was so off model? Yes. There was a commission
Yeah.
story I got that was the word count was wrong, the genre was miles away. I could tell it from the title, but I read it to be sure, and yep. And I just told the person, like, I'm sorry, this is no bueno, and I'll I'll talk to you again some other time. And I got someone else to fill that spot, to be frank. So yes, once I did have to do that because not because like I got mad or they're a bad writer,
Yeah, no, you
because
have
it
a
was
specific
so
purview.
yeah, it was so spectacularly off model. I didn't want to, and I have a schedule. I have a production
Right,
schedule all the time, right? So I didn't want to mess around being like, "Oh, can you write me another thing?" And then maybe that's also
right.
marvelously off model.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's just one of those things where I was like, "Yeah, I'm gonna go to somebody else who I know can like hit the bullseye
yeah.
every time," and
It
they did.
happens.
So
Happens to
yeah,
the best
yeah,
of us.
yeah. No, I don't feel bad about it. Just that's what happened. So new question.
Factual.
Carl C75 asks, how do you deal with your own opinions as editor or publisher on how a story should go versus the author? Like, have any debates or discussions on this led to wildly different outcomes than either the editor, publisher, or author expected? Jay, I'll toss that to you first.
So I mean the answer is like there is always like sort of an editor expectation, and the editor expectation for me, generally speaking, is this shaped and sized like the thing that I asked for if I am commissioning, or is this shaped and sized like the thing that I want if I'm just like on an open submission uh call, so to speak. Um and so for me, I also do a lot of dev editing privately, and so that's one of those skills that I will often drag in with me when I am doing submissions where I'm in charge of like what happens after the submission process. So like not for Uncanny or Viable Paradise, but like for submissions for an anthology, a lot of what I'm doing is sort of like taking what's brought to me and threading the individual elements together in the event that they are um not lining up with what I wanted exactly in the initial thing. And I mean, I think anyone that has worked with me as a dev has probably like can tell you like I feel like I have a pretty good eye for like here's the thing you brought me and here's how I can make that thing better. Like my whole job as a dev editor is not to be like, hey, you didn't do this right. It's more like, oh hey, I see that you're doing this thing and this thing. Why don't we thread those two things together and see what that makes? Like, let's see how we can connect those things. And that's really like more the type of development that I like to do personally.
Yeah.
And I'm going to pass that over to you, Oliver, if you have any other thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it just comes down to me. This feels very cliche, but I guess this is for people who, the stream is for people who aren't super familiar with this stuff already. For me, it's always comes down to how can I help the author execute their story. I'm not here to tell them like I think the dog should die on page 3, not 5 or whatever. It's not about me forcing my opinions on them. And if I get an idea like, oh, wouldn't it be great if like this happened instead? Then I put it to them as a suggestion. I never put it to them as a fix. I think editors who do that are bad editors, period, or bad teachers. I have a story I've told too many times about a screenwriting teacher I had a long while time ago who had people go around the class pitch the basics of their idea, and then he would respond. And for mine, it was like an unlikable guy who kills a detective who kills his partner, or whatever. And and he said to me quite straight faced, "Why would I ever want to read that?" I took it as a challenge, of course. So I was like, "Well, let me tell you." But I only got about that far before he cut me off and said, "No, why would anyone want to read a story with an unlikable protagonist?" And so he just had it in his mind that like that's impossible. Nobody would ever like that. Now I don't need to explain why that's foolish or how a million stories that I had enjoyed with unlikable protagonists had like blew up in my mind when I heard him say that. But that was like one of my first like really early formative experiences with what is essentially bad editing or bad teaching in that case, but same dynamic of just like saying, well, I think everything should be like this. I think the way I write is good, therefore that is good writing. So yeah, putting that on the author is just doing a bad job. Doing a
Yeah.
bad job. So that's how I deal with my opinions. Is I try to not force them on the author. I try to check myself and be like, well, like, is this a fix or is this just me thinking that's cool? And while if it's just me thinking that's cool, it's probably because there's no problem attached to it,
Right.
right? Does Billy going through that door earlier fix something? No, it gives me a rush when I imagine it. So that's when you just throw stuff in the comments and say, hey, tossing it out there. What if we did this? So yeah, I mean, have there been debates or discussions, leading to wildly different outcomes than either I myself or the author? I don't know about debates. It sounds more combative than any of the discussions I usually have with authors I work with.
That's fair.
Sometimes there's discussions, but they tend to be more brainstorming. And I can't think of any
Oh, I
off the top
love
of my
that part.
head.
That's my favorite is like when I get to like, especially, I mean, I was talking about this a little bit with Brent last on Tuesday,
Mm,
but like one of the things that he did for me when we were going back and forth is he actually sent me his like working doc where he
mm,
had his ideas, and so I
yes.
was able to pick through the ideas and go like, oh, what if we thread this thing and this thing, and that I feel like we got a lot of mileage out of that.
Well, and that's a pleasure when you're working with a smaller amount of authors or doing one-on-one dev
Yes.
editing. With
Yeah.
Ness, I have like
Yeah.
a lot of
The amount
authors.
of time in a day you have, sir, you do not always know exactly how much time that is.
Yeah, I generally don't do that. That being said, what I do is I always give the authors this option, and pretty much all of them have taken me up on it. Where when we first go, okay, yes, you're going to be in the magazine, you're going to do a story, cool, that's settled. I will offer to do a phone call or video call where they can then tell me about their idea, and we discuss it through that way. It's a kind of like mini writing room of two,
Yeah.
with me playing subordinate, even though technically, yes, I'm hierarchically higher because I'm the publisher, but I play myself subordinate
Right.
because it's their
You've
story.
invited them to do something, you have to at least let them do it.
Yeah, exactly, right? So that's what I do, and usually, I think that's probably why I haven't had a lot of these, like, big, like, tear it up, move things around discussions
Right.
later when in the actual dev editing, because in a sense, I've already agreed
You've
to
done you've
what
done
the
the
story is.
prelims.
Yeah, so that's an unusual process, perhaps. I don't know what other magazines do in that regard or if other magazines do that process, but I like it. It works well with commissioning stories, of course. Open subs would be a whole 'nother story, and I imagine I would have more of these bigger discussions of ripping things up and so on
Right.
if it came to that. All right, new question. Teff Johnson asks, "What are some of your favorite tropes of the genre?" And, connected to that, can you give an example of one of your favorite scenes you've read in Sword and Sorcery?
Ooh, that's a toughie. I would have to say that like I kind of so I also kind of like burn out all of my questions about tropes very early on in this crowdfund. This is maybe a mistake on my part logistically.
Yeah, go for it here. New
Um,
people might be hearing it for the first time.
but I mean, I would say that like as far as tropes go, for Sword and Sorcery specifically, I am just so fond of the traveling pair, or the traveling trio, such as it may be. Like I love people like bouncing people off of each other specifically. Like that's one of my absolute favorite things to do as a writer. So it's also something I look for in other people's writing as well. I feel like thinking about, just for example, like Kirk Johnson's story that we did for a story chat a while back, like the way those characters interact with each other is just like it's like lightning. What's like it's perfect. They
Cock
are
and Bull
not
from the
close
Overhangs, by the
friends.
way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Cock and Bull.
Yeah, sorry.
And that was just done so well. So I would say like that's a good, as far as like tropes that will always catch my attention is going to be something in that category. What was the other half of that question? Because I kind of lost it.
Can
In
you give an
about that.
example? Can you give an
Oh yeah, there's an
example of
example
one
right
of the
there.
of one of your favorite scenes you've read in Sword and Sorcery? So I think a specific
So
scene.
mainly, if we're gonna talk about that, like in the initial fight scene in that story that we were talking about, was so good because it worked on so many levels. The fight was very interesting, the characters were very interesting, and you get the sense after the fact of how much you actually don't know as the reader. And that was really like refreshing and fascinating for me.
Mhm. Well, you're truly I'm a difficult sod. I don't like to think in terms of tropes because I feel it demystifies fiction to turn it into a bunch of Lego bricks, man.
Oh.
That being said, whatever. It's a way of people for people to discuss and understand stories, and I know I'm being a special little fellow when I think that way.
Allow me to retrieve
Um,
a cloud for you to yell out, old man.
yeah, old man.
I'm just
Anyway,
messing with
what?
you, you know it.
But yeah. That being said, obviously, like I know what it means and so on. So I don't know. I do know that in Sword and Sorcery, I always like when people encounter the fantastic and the terrible, and they stand their ground, but they still feel fear. I mean, when I think about it, that's one of those primal things that made Conan appeal to me when I first came across this whole thing as a kid and Savage Sword. I really loved that he was very capable and would fight any man. But
Right.
oh dear, there's a cosmic horror, and like sometimes he would actually end up having to run because there's no other choice. But one way or another, he would kind of like he would push through his fear to try and triumph one way or another. However, whether that was living to run away for another day, kind of thing, or
Right.
actually defeating the horrible thingy somehow or another. But it's often said that's like the primal difference between Lovecraft and Howard, right? It's
Yeah.
and how Howard's protagonists actually like push through their feelings and deal with the cosmic
Right.
horror, as opposed to Lovecraft, where you wind up gibbering in an asylum. So yeah, I guess I like that a lot. I like anything where like characters claim or reclaim personal agency. Something about that's deeply appealing to me, which is funny because it's not like I've been so under the thumb of society my whole life. But yeah, whatever reason it is, that really appeals to me in stories when that happens. What are some of my favorite scenes I've read in Sword and Sorcery? There's a whole bunch, but I guess like one that comes to mind. Oh God, of course I forget the name of the story. It's like the Iron Statue or something like that. The Conan story where he runs into a guy who is built up and built up and built up. It's like, this guy is a big beefy fella. He's so big and beefy. He's been bred or trained since youth to break necks. Breaking necks is what he does. And then, he goes to break Conan's neck and Conan breaks his neck. Oh my God. And like, that's so simple. And I'm saying it kind of like an excited kid because it sounds like a thing for a kid, but it's just fun. It's just the fun thing of like a villain being built up, built up, built up, and then oh geez, like they get undone very quickly in a way that's kind of funny. Maybe that's where you come back to tropes as far as like those sorts of
Oh
things I
yeah.
like.
See, that
But
feels very tropey to me in a way that I can't quite pin down the exact trope. Like I'd have to sit on TV tropes for a couple minutes and dig, but I feel like pretty confident that that's a trope.
probably, and then the other one, gosh, just
I'm
the
sure we're
the
gonna get
cli-
corrections in the chat for that one.
Yeah, the climax of Lean Times in Lankmar, where spoiler for a fairly old story, but it's the one, folks, if you can't remember what I'm talking about, it's the one where it's all about religion basically, and Patrick Grey Mouse are being on the outs for most of it, and this whole
Yes.
idea of like, is this god is like the jug really possessing Fafford? Who knows? And we just have this whole big climax where he like bursts out of a bed that he's been strapped to, and just whatever. It makes me laugh really, really hard. That scene,
You
if you
can
know what I'm
never
talking
explain the
about.
circumstances of a Fafhrd and Grey Mouser story without sounding really fucked up.
Yeah, and also it's a climax, so I would have to tell the whole story pretty much to
Yeah.
contextualize it. But if you haven't read it, Lean Times in Lankmar, great story, and for my bet, easily one of the funniest ones. Period. Not just Fafhrd Mouser, but Sword and Sorcery, like the classics at large. Yeah. All right. New question. We got a lot of questions. Neil Wilcox asks, "Is there a monster you think is underused or badly used, or is thinking about monsters a distraction from core Sword and Sorcery ideas?" Jay.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know that I personally am like, oh man, I'm so tired of this type of monster, but that's partially, I think, because like I always kind of think of them as sort of, I hate to say it, but like I don't think of the monsters as the first and foremost issue in a Sword and Sorcery story. I still kind of like center the characters in a way that is maybe not as helpful. um but I also like, I don't think that I'm at a point where I'm like I've ever like overdosed on it. So I would say
Mm.
that the thing that I mostly am looking for is like something unique and something that helps the author bring things out about the characters, if that's possible, if you can think of it that way. Like something that develops the specific issues of the character that you're dealing with. And I hate to like lean on my own work here, but like one of the things that I did specifically with the main character of the most recent novel that I was working on is specifically created a few villains that are specifically antithetical to the beliefs of that character. And so like
Yeah.
some of the things he has to confront are sort of um demons that he has himself created in a sense. And so that was like that felt meaningful to me to work on. And when I see things that are like that in other people's work, that's one of those things where I'm like, aha, I see what you're doing there and I like it. It's just sort of like finding ways for the villain of your story or the monster of your story, the things that you're like that your character, your author avatar, sort of whatever thing you want to do with it, that character is fighting against things that are sort of like meaningful to them, and that I think will do a lot.
Yeah, I would just like +1 all that, and I would also say I'm a big fan of the monster as symptom of a sickness in the region where it resides,
Yes.
which is a good way
Yes.
of maybe tying into like the themes of the story, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
I would
absolutely.
also would say whenever I'm editing, and quite a few authors who worked with me on the magazine, if they see this, will be like, oh yeah. Well, is I will almost always say go weirder,
Yeah,
go even
absolutely.
weirder, go capital W weirder. And I don't just mean like, I don't know, put some tentacles on it, like put a bird on it from Portlandia. I mean, like really try to think about how it can be unsettling. Usually through exploring all five senses. That's one thing for sure.
Yeah.
People tend to err almost entirely on visuals. I think, and it's good to think about like what smell or weird taste through the air perhaps a person might get. Or maybe they are forced to bite into the monster. I don't know. You know.
Yeah. One of the things I
So
want to throw on top of that, just because you did mention the sensory thing, one of the things that I always try to tell people is that like one of the reasons that Lovecraft worked really well is that he left a lot of things to your imagination. You can't do as much as he did in terms of like not describing things, but all of the things you don't describe have to be just as scary.
in a sense, yeah. I mean, definitely the like indescribable Watson. I think
Yeah,
is one of those things where
you
like,
can't make them totally numinous, but as much things as much as you can leave threatening.
yeah.
Um that's really what I like and prefer as far as like a monster.
Hmm. By the way, I was thinking about monsters as a distraction from core SMS ideas.
Yeah, kind of.
Um, I
But it is and it isn't. Like, you know.
no, I no, I would say no. I would say if it's no, I would say no. I would say no because monsters can be more or less part of the story depending on what the story's needs are.
Yeah,
And
that's
thinking
true.
about them, maybe you just think of like a cool monster and you want to write a story to excuse that existing on the page, and that's fine too. No, I don't think it's a distraction at all. I just think that it's not like, my beloved Brian Murphy's 7 point, flexible definition. None of the things really have to do with monsters except for the fact that horror is a major part of sword and sorcery.
Right.
And you might think of now horror doesn't have to be monsters. There's other ways to express that, but
Right.
I think it is worth thinking along the lines of things that are genuinely terrifying. Again, come back to my favorite thing I mentioned earlier with Conan, right? It's definitely more interesting to have monsters that are terrifying and unique, in my opinion,
Mhm.
than to have things that are just like part of an ecosystem. And as I say that, I think of exceptions, but whatever. That's
Right.
my general thing I err for. And also, I'm just a big fan of creatures that are like more inhuman. If you're gonna have something actually speak, if you're gonna have it walk around on two legs and be sort of like a D&D demi-human, at least for me and my preferences, boy, you gotta go hard on making that thing different and not make it just a person who has a funny face. In that case, I always like to err on the fact that in Sword and Sorcery, you tend to, instead of getting, demi-human races, you tend to just get other strange human cultures. I really like that. But I am now talking a little of the show and not thinking very much about editing. So, like I said, when it comes about editing and creatures, generally speaking, I will see how it can be tied into the character the way Jay described, into the themes and the setting the way I mentioned, and just go harder and weirder. Like you can't go wrong making your creatures stranger as long as they can still be parsed enough to make sense
Right.
by the
Yeah.
reader. Because what you don't ever want, and with anything in your story, is stuff that will make the reader go, "Oh yeah, yeah, I know what this is," and kind of skim and kind of like disassociate from the thing a little bit. You know what I mean? You
Yeah.
want them to be drawn in, like, "Wait, what is this? Oh, that's compelling, right?" And so if you
Yeah.
throw out stuff that's
You
kind
need
of a
to
stock
keep the
creature,
mystery.
right? If you throw out a stock creature or a creature that's just like, I don't know, it's something to fight, then yeah, people won't get as engaged, or they might go, "Oh yeah, this is like, I think I saw this in D&D." Hey, moving on. All right, so Eric, beleaguered grad student, uh, asks, while recommending story revisions, how do you weigh artistic considerations against what you think your anticipated readership wants? Or to what extent do you think the two factors are intertwined?
Oh, that's fascinating. So I'm going to say that that really depends. So a lot of the editing work that I do where I'm actually like digging into something, um, I would say that those are ooh, like if I'm editing as a dev editor, most of the time, like up until I was working on various anthologies, most of what I would say I'm doing is digging for like reader satisfaction to an extent in terms of like, okay, well, if the elements of the story are too disparate, we're not going to get the satisfaction of having read the whole story and like journeyed with that character, so to speak. And so, especially in the context of something like Sword and Sorcery, where there's usually some kind of journey, usually some kind of battle, some kind of like prevailing over some other type of force. you want to have all of those beats met, and then anything additional on top of that is just sort of is fantastic, and you can really you can use those extra elements to kind of add flavor to what you're trying to build. Um, yes, that's an exceptionally good point.
Yeah.
Um,
Part of why I like
uh,
creating stories. Yeah. Anyway, you
yes.
were saying.
So, in terms of like what I would say, like my preferences are as an editor are almost always coming from the place of being a reader, also because I feel like I can safely say that I read extensively. So, like, I don't feel like I generally don't feel like I'm not bringing something to the table in terms of just sort of like what I have already read and what I might prescribe to somebody as a as as a as a client, or as one of my authors for an anthology, for example. Like most of the time what
Can
I'm
I
thinking about, ooh,
can I build on this question? Sorry, finish your
go
thought, but
for it.
then I'm curious. With this anthology, we've kind of had two readerships in mind,
Oh yeah, we
right?
have.
And so would you say that's changed the way you would answer this
um
question regarding this specific
I
anthology?
don't know that it's changed the question, so to speak, but it definitely changes. Like, so there are certain romantic things that I have been looking for out of each of the submissions that we received, and then and submissions by submissions, I mean people we commissioned, and then they have sent us our
Yeah.
stories. Um, uh, the that I was looking for elements of both romance and sword and sorcery to be present in them, and generally speaking, I would say that those are like both of those axes together kind of add a slight increase in difficulty. Like we're not doing the double black diamond yet, but we might soon. But in general, like I would say that for me is more like my familiarity with both of those genres informing like what I'm seeing from my authors, and sort of like nudging it in one direction or another to be like, okay, well we can enhance this element for added like romantic zhuzh, or we can do, you know, a little bit more with this particular fight scene because we really need to have a little bit more emotion out of the characters, or that sort of thing. Like that's I would say that that's generally the type of fixes I would want to make as an editor, but that's largely to serve the reader. That's not really like to serve my
Mhm,
own personal taste. Um,
mhm.
and that's because in part I'm not working just to serve my own personal taste on this project.
Well, yeah, same, right? It's not like we commission these stories
Yeah,
for us to privately read and then just put them in a box, and so,
right.
yeah, like yeah, I
Right.
would you
So
say there's been any point so far in your editing where, there was a moment that's like the author's like, "Oh, I wanna do this for these artistic reasons," and you're like, "Yes, but that's not what the readership wants, so it has to
right.
die."
I mean,
Or,
there's been a couple of things where I've had to be like, all right, well, house style on this is gonna be this.
yeah,
And that's I would say largely just sort of like cool factor stuff. Like when you think of like the elements that a story has just like because you think they're cool.
yeah,
And I've had to kind of like pull back on a couple of those and just be like, all right, can we find a way to make this a little bit more aligned with either like a romance thing or a sword and sorcery thing, depending on what we have on
yeah,
deck. And like that one advantage of having stories that I have commissioned from, or that you have commissioned from, like all of these very talented people, is just that I can kind of clash them together a little bit and go like, all right, well, so I have this one that's doing this thing and this one that's doing that thing, and then that may or may not actually influence like what I tell the authors individually, but it does influence how I want the stories to go a little bit.
mhm. Yeah,
Like
because 'cause you're
we
looking
do
at the
have
overall composition of the anthology, and so, yeah, there's, like,
right.
these different
They all
factors.
have to they all have to be they have to be on this on at least the same page in the sense that they all should belong under the same cover. Um
Yep, yep.
that's my real primary.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, like, I don't know, I said to myself when I'm doing the magazine, like, well, that story I mentioned earlier that I actually had to push back and go, "Sorry, nope,"
Yeah.
and actually didn't even ask for another story from that author. Um, Whether it was good or bad was irrelevant to me. It
Yeah.
was the fact that it was just so incredibly off model, and I didn't want anyone who spends their money on the magazine to go, "Why is this in here?" Maybe they by chance would end up loving it, but certainly like it would be a surprise, and then it makes them wonder,
Right.
well, when I buy another issue, am I going to get what I'm looking for. And so,
Right.
of course, we've all heard people complain about being made to slavishly follow a model or something and crank out extruded product or whatever. But I'd like to think
Right.
there's some sort of gradient between that
Right. Well, and
and
actually that's
completely
sort of
unrestrained, anything at all goes, not
yeah,
nonsense.
that's actually kind of
Uh,
what I really liked about what we came up with for this anthology, was that we had two genres that are in conversation with each other in interesting ways that we could kind of bounce we can kind of bounce those things against each other and see what happens, and that I think has been very fruitful so far. So
yeah, sometimes choosing
that
between one or the other, or often getting really cool blends, which is what I was hoping
yes,
for.
it's the blend
Um,
that is really like viscerally satisfying to get.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, I mean, I do think that like artistic and considerations and anticipated reader wants, pardon me. I will tend to lean a little bit towards anticipated readership wants because I'm a publisher and I want people to keep buying my thing and I want them to feel they can trust that they are getting what they want when they buy the thing. That being said, of course, readers also love to be surprised. And so
Yes.
my feeling is if there's a big surprise, if the artistic consideration is something really cool that maybe goes against the expectations, but in a way that like will be satisfying, that kind of still
Yes.
fits overall within the genre rather than just being like, I don't know, here's like the clown from Stephen King's It for some reason showing up in, Sword and Sorcery Story. Although as I said that, I was like, oh, that could be kind of funny. But anyway, but you know what I
I was
mean,
gonna
right? It's this
say,
whole, it's this whole well, the curse, right? Any jokey example you come up with,
oh
half
yeah.
the time you'll be like, actually, I would
I'm
like
just
that.
saying some of
But
us have read The Dark Tower.
me too. That's why as I started to say it, I was like, oh wait, nah. But
Yeah.
anyway, point being that to me, there's just a consideration thing. It's kind of like asking, well, what about the go off model? And it's
Yeah.
like you
It
can
has
go off
to
model and still be on model if that makes sense. You can go
yes.
off model in a
Well,
way
because
that like
surprise is part of the model.
exactly, and
So
and,
so
and
you have
because
to
you
be
can go
able to
off
get
model in
away
a
with
way that
it.
still fits because it's coming at off model at kind of an angle that works, as opposed to feeling just totally random,
Yeah,
or just being a
exactly.
completely different genre that is not what anybody's looking for in the magazine. So yeah, I would say anticipated readership wants does trump artistic considerations for me most of the time. But not to like a 90-10 split or anything. It's not like, oh, I don't care
Right.
about art. I don't care about trying cool new things. If that was the case, I wouldn't be doing New Edge Sword and Sorcery. I'd be doing regurgitated, 80s classic Sword and Sorcery or something. Anyway, moving on. Pixel Saber asks, did you look to other editors for inspiration in regards to this anthology in particular? If so, which ones? That feels like a J exclusive because I'm not editing it.
Oh,
So yeah.
that's a great question, and the worst part of it is that I don't have a good answer. I will say that I have leaned extensively on Ursula Le Guin just in general, like as a career, like um lodestone, so to speak. Like uh I recently picked up Language of the Night, and that's basically been my like I hesitate to call it a comfort read because it's weird to call a nonfiction book a comfort read, but it kind of is because her talking about craft is just like I love it. I need it.
I'm
And
guessing you've read
so
Steering the Craft?
um I have, yeah. That was actually like Steering the Craft was like probably one of the first like real like writer workshop books I ever read. And
Mm,
I still lean on that. I actually lean on Steering the Craft a lot for like when I'm editing in a dev edit capacity.
yep.
That's a lot of the time like things that I'll lean on for exercises there. Because it's just she is so incisive and so thoughtful about language in a way that like I long to be. um and I'm hoping that I get there someday.
I think Ursula K. Le
um
Guin is completely acceptable as, hashtag editor goals. My God. I mean, if you can't aspire if you can't aspire to be her, you know?
right? And I'm not even to aspire to be her. It was just that it was nice to share a planet with her for a significant amount of time.
Mhm.
And like that I would say is probably like my like the closest thing I have to like a specific goal there.
Yeah.
Because I just yeah,
But
that's my
I'm
answer.
actually wondering though, what about your experience as a slush reader and the editors you've gotten to know doing that? Did
Oh,
you ever
well,
think of any of
so
them when working on this
um
anthology or in general?
well, with this anthology, not so much because I'm working this anthology. The advantage that I had is that I could ask people that I specifically wanted to read things from.
Mm,
So I didn't have that problem. But like when I'm reading for Uncanny and stuff like that, of course that I do have I do have our editors in chief, the Thomases in mind when I'm reading for them, and I also have like the various folks that have come in and done the editorial chair there, just because everyone does have different tastes, and it's kind of like sometimes it's hard to like gauge that because it's just the history of the magazine is now 10 years, 11 years is the current Kickstarter. So like there's a lot of history there, and so sometimes you can just lean on the history instead of like the specific person. And
Yeah.
that's something like one of the things that I've tried to explain to people when I'm talking about like reading slush or whatever is it's like it's not just that your story has to be good, it's that your story has to stand up next to all of these other authors. Like you need to be able to stand up next to John Chu. You need to be able to stand up next to like just authors who are producing stories that are like visceral and cathartic and all of these other numinous things that I can't tell you how to write that way. Like so you have to just kind of bring your A game and hope that it's gonna make it through the slush pile. And it's hard. It's so fucking hard. But
Yep.
yeah, so I mean like
Yep.
for that kind of thing, like yeah, I would be thinking about who's reading it above me. But um yeah, beyond that, I don't have a specific answer for even for slush stuff. Like obviously if I was reading for you, Oliver, I would definitely have a very specific kind of purview in mind because I
Yep.
know what you want for New Age Sword and Sorcery. Like I feel like I have a pretty good idea of what
Well, I
your
certainly at this point, after working
desires
on the
are.
anthology together,
Yeah.
yeah, no, I've definitely given some emphatic, me like this, me not like that, but also some more
Yes.
more thoughtful philosophy about it all, I suppose.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, yeah. I mean, as far as like I said, I think this is kind of just a J only question. I mean, because did I look to other editors for inspiration in regards to this anthology in particular? I mean, I looked to you, Jay, to come in and be the editor. So I
You
don't
did.
know. That's the best I can answer there, I suppose. But it is nice that we're on the same page with the Gwen, who, yeah,
Yeah.
Steering the Craft also has influenced my dev editing at times, for sure. I always like her word chastening
Yes.
pick a better verb rather than sticking a big adverb on there, that kind of thing.
Yes.
Um, you know, charged instead of running quickly or whatever. Anyway, yeah, moving on. Okay, so Matteo Arans asks, what approach or approaches do you take when editing your own work versus editing someone else's?
Oh, I'm a lot meaner to myself. Uh,
Yeah, that was my first thought. I was like,
I
I just
mean,
go hard when it's
and we've talked about this on a different stream before when we had Valerie on as well. But like, so Valerie is basically my first reader. She's the one who gets to see all of my absolute scrappiest bullshit, and so like, sometimes that takes the form of like showing her a piece of prose and her just sort of like combing all the knots out of it, and then sometimes it's more like, all right, well, but how could you push this a little harder? Can you make this character a little bit more X or Y. Like there's a reasonable amount of like pushback that she can offer me that a lot of people kind of can't. And having people that you can trust with your prose is probably like the single best thing you can do as a writer. If you can find a writing group of some sort that you can work with so that those people can tell you, hey, you're not actually like really pushing yourself here and you could totally be pushing yourself. Or hey, you're pushing yourself and you need to go the fuck to bed.
Yeah, yeah. I find I need that one a little more.
Yes.
There's I think you've already, I mean, I think it's mainly been in the context of dumb jokes or whatever, but you've definitely had me discussing like stuff with you over the course of the anthology where I just get possessed for 5 minutes with like a dumb idea.
Yes.
uh,
Yes.
but yeah, yeah, yeah.
We have a we have a
Um,
we have a Discord emoji that says stop typing and sleep for
yeah,
a
well, there's that,
reason.
yeah, for sure. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, that was your answer or?
I think that's pretty much my answer. In terms of like the amount of compassion I show myself is probably less than I should. Versus the amount of compassion I really try to bring to my authors. Like I'm really when I'm editing for someone else, like the last thing I want them to do is feel like the story is bad. Because that's not the
Oh yeah,
case. Like there are stories that are going to be hard to sell, and that's just like the fact of what they are. But that doesn't make them bad stories. It just makes them stories with a complicated audience.
Mm.
And that's something that a lot of things, like when I get them for dev editing purposes, it's like, oh well, it's already been to slush here, 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 and here. And I'm like, all right, well, I can't help you get into any of those places. So like, why don't we look at it and like take it and kind of view both like what you're aiming for out of the story, like what emotional resonance are you looking for out of the story, and then like where can we aim it. um and that might be something that I would do there. But that's always like, to me that's always like a very specific kind of conversation. I'm trying to think of a way to put it, but like that conversation's a very specific one for a specific subset of people that I've worked with. Beyond that, I would say, yeah, I really just try to remember that like I'm also a writer, and so like I have to kind of take care of my own soul while I'm working on something as an editor, because all of these things tie together. So
Yeah.
I think that's
I
I
think
think that's probably what I have to say on that.
I think I've become a better editor of myself by editing others. And I don't just mean the fact that I've had more practice, of course. It's taking that being like I don't think I've ever been super harsh on myself, but definitely in my trying to be kind and yet simultaneously helpful, because you're not being kind if you are just like being nice and not showing where things need to be
Yeah.
fixed.
Oh, there's
Or
nice and
what, you
not
know,
kind, and kind and not nice.
yeah. But yeah, it's like, am I trying to be as useful as possible while not, sometimes people do that. They'll send you their story and they'll be like, "Oh man, you can be just as like brutal as you want." It's like brutal isn't like a
Oh,
sign of doing a good job. Brutal is a tone. It's not level of
yeah.
effectiveness. And then I get where it comes from. I totally do, because
Oh yeah.
we've all had that experience of sending people stories and then they like react poorly when you say, "What if you change this?" But anyway, point being, to me, it's not about brutal or whatever. It's about utility. It's about actionable notes. And
Right.
so when I'm trying to edit someone else's story, I try to I try to okay, but I'm talking all over the show because I have too much to say. Yeah, so what way I've improved editing myself is by looking at how I try to make things easier on other people and then give those tools to myself, when I'm turning around and looking in the mirror. So because when I work with myself, I know that I don't have to worry about that's not true. I choose not to worry about overwhelming the author, but because when I'm
Right.
dealing with someone else, if I give them a checklist that's, like, really hyper granular and has 100 items on it, that's not good. That's not helping
No.
them because it's gonna probably overwhelm them. So I try and speak more broadly and apply, teach a man to fish rather than say exactly what all these fish are. But when I deal with myself, then it's like, well, I'm not gonna get offended by me. I'm not gonna, and I think in quotation marks, I'm not gonna get overwhelmed by me. Um, and yet, when I
Yeah.
get a big piece of graph paper and have like 35 squares, 35, please, more, each one with like specific little things and stuff, passes and so on, inevitably I find myself having to edit my edit list to make it more
Right.
manageable on myself, to at least break into categories or color grade it with like 6 colors of highlighter, just something, because I don't worry as much about communicating well with myself as I do when editing someone else. And so, yeah, it's kind of funny that way. It's not that I'm harder on myself; it's so that I have give less consideration to myself. If that makes
Right, right. One of the thoughts that I have, just sort of like as sort of a dovetail on this, is if I as an editor have made you feel worse about your story, I fucked up. I have not done my job. Like fundamentally, I am almost always like, if I'm editing a story and I'm not like 100% jazzed about it, there's still something I'm excited about it. And like I will generally like turn away a story if I don't have any, like if I just don't have a spark with it. But in general, like I can find a spark in almost anything. And so for me, I want to bring that excitement back to the author, because part of the reason we write is that excitement of this thing that's in my head is being conveyed to someone else. Like they're intaking this thing that I just thought up, and it's like the that I want to give that excitement back to the author. I want to make sure that that comes through in anything that I do with an edit letter. Usually what I do is an edit letter with like a little bit of sandwichy kind of stuff in terms of like, here are the things that I really like. Here are like, because I want to make sure that the things that I like don't disappear either. Like that's really important.
yeah.
But yeah,
Oh yeah,
so
no, I always
I do an
highlight
edit
like so
letter
like
and
even if
then separate notes. So
Yeah, even if it's just a smiley, and often that's all it is, but that's all I'm trying to
Oh
say is
yeah.
I like this. I will drop those where they feel right,
My
and if I
comment
feel really
lines with
emphatic,
yes in them are a non-zero number in all of my documents so far.
yeah, and when I feel really emphatic, I might write a sentence explaining, "This is great because," you know?
Yep.
Um, yeah, it's so
Yep.
important to put that in
Spelling
these
it out.
guidance as well as, "I think this isn't good or this isn't good, this doesn't work." Anyway, I feel like we've answered that one enough for the time we have given.
Yes.
Matthew, I hope that was helpful. Now, funny enough, we have a question from a New Age Sword and Sorcery author, someone who's been there from the beginning, issue 0, Daryl Keogh. Um,
Nice.
Now, when Daryl Keogh dropped this in the Discord, he also said something very nice about my editing, but I will leave that out because my ego is not the point of this. So, Daryl's question. I have a general question for editors, so both of us, I guess. How do you keep from stamping your personal style and preferences on another's art? What guides you in drawing the line between polishing an author's work and remaking it to your personal taste? If I have read it, this is a question which I think I'll have to keep asking myself. Yeah, I guess I feel like we kind of addressed this a little bit earlier, actually. Shoot. But yeah,
Yeah,
Jay, what do you think?
to an extent. Like in general, when I'm editing, and this might be partially because like I don't do copy at all. Like I have way too much ADHD to do copy. I do some line work, but most of my line work is in service of like an idea the author already has. So like if there's like a shorter way to say something, I might indicate that in like my line edit that goes in the Word document with like my little comment lines. But I very rarely try to like really put a hard stamp on what someone else is doing unless like it's a genuinely wrong word choice or something like that. Like I don't try to impose a lot because I know I am only human. Like I know that I'm also prone to mistakes and so um I don't really like to correct people. I generally like to leave it to like, all right, there's probably a reason they chose this word. Like let's see if it's like, oh, it's just like transposed like formally versus formerly or something like that. Those are fine, and I'm not gonna I'm gonna do those and not quibble about them. But if it's something where like someone's chosen an adverb, just as like an example from Ursula Le Guin's, like choosing a verb and an adverb instead of like a stronger verb. I might put the stronger verb there, or at least like suggest the stronger verb in a comment, but I'm probably not gonna like line strike it and put the word there because I won't want them to think that that is like a mandatory thing. But I'll put it there like this might be tighter if we did this, and then this adds this amount of flavor because it's a word that does. I try to give those sort of notes with like thought behind them as opposed to just being like, oh, the word is quickly or what like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you know what I mean? Like just
Charged instead
there's
of run quickly.
no
Yeah.
exactly. There we go. I am inadequately caffeinated, so
Sure. Yeah, no, I hear you. I mean, for me, yeah, it's I mean, God, because some of my preferences are quite strong, and so it can be very
I was gonna
tempting.
say you have house style. And that's fine. Like a magazine or an anthology is gonna have house style. That just happens. It's necessary.
Well, yes, of course. So I was gonna say, actually, there is different context, right? When I'm dev editing or just reading for Buddy, it's not the same as the magazine. So, for
Right.
example, it is house style literally things like, in this house we spell sword and sorcery, sword ampersand sorcery. Yeah, of course that I just do line strikes because like that's our jam.
Yeah,
That's
that's
that's how
easy.
we do.
That's fine. That's
But that's something else, of course. I think we're getting at here in terms of personal style and preferences on others' art. Sorry, this is just so funny because I know Daryl is going through a manuscript that has my notes all over it. So I'm just kind of like, am I having a private conversation with Daryl on camera here? But anyway, yes. In general, like I said earlier, I think when we were kind of dancing around the same issue, I try to check myself, like, why am I suggesting this change? If I'm suggesting
yeah.
this change purely because of, well, I like it better this way. Okay, Oliver, like maybe make a suggestion. Don't just, as you say, make the
Right.
edit and
Yeah.
lines. But that being said, if I, yeah, gosh, because I think most of my preferences that I do just kind of go like, and do them. I will explain them in the overall notes that I
Yeah.
put at the end for starters, and second of all, I will because I have that explanation, I'll feel more confident, right? If I'm just doing it because I have a feeling like that noise is all I get in my head. Okay, that's no good.
Right.
But if my explanation is like, well, I think this will, lead to smoother sentences. It'll help people
Right.
not yeah, whatever. If I have an explanation, then I'm more cocky and I'll be like, well, I gave my explanation, they can reject that or not. And as a result, they can reject or not all these versions of essentially the same note that I'm giving throughout, for example.
Right.
But that's getting more like line copy editing kind of edits.
Yeah.
In terms of edits of like storytelling, yeah, I gosh, no, I am human and have my editing sins, but so far I've been pretty good about not saying I think that this should happen. I am very
Right.
unlikely to mess with events or the character of a character. It's very rare. I'll be like,
The
"What is this
only time
person's
I will
actually
do
thinking?"
that is more like, oh, I would picture this character doing this, and usually what I do is a note rather than like, and that's like a note
Yeah,
in line, just to be like, is this action in line with this character's beliefs in this thing or whatever. Like, I will question those kind of things just because sometimes I need to know them. Just as like
yeah,
a for example from an anthology that never came to fruition. I had an author who had prior military experience, and I do not have prior military experience, so I had lots of questions that were like, is this a thing, like.
yeah. What is this
And sometimes
jargon?
I
Yeah, what
like.
is this foreign word? What is this? Yeah, stuff
Right,
like
and
that for
so
sure.
exactly, this is, like, clarifying things, but also, like, clarifying, like, character motive or, like, character behavior in the context, and so, like, I tried to be thoughtful about that, but I still definitely, like, um there were still, like, things that she came back to me and was like, "No, this would definitely be like this." I was
Yeah,
like, "Okay."
but also
I
sometimes it might be
I'm very open to
something.
being steaded, you know?
Well, sure, and also it can be kinda like it can get you to what you need to give them the better
Yeah,
note.
sometimes it's the
So
question
sometimes
asked is, like, leading to where you need to go.
right, yeah, like what you described, like I had that in a story recently I was editing where I was kinda like, "I don't know if this character," which I'd seen in previous stories, "I don't know if this character would do that. It seems kinda like more like this other one would behave that way." And then the author explained, and I was kinda like, "Oh, okay," but then it's like, in the explanation, it was like, "Well, I think this should happen. I'm going for this." I was like, "Okay, well, if that's what you're going for, now I know what you're going for. Here's how I think you
Yeah,
can
so here's how
elevate
we can
that
clarify
element
that.
and quickly draw that out." Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. It is 11:56, and I am determined to have this wrap up by or before noon. So we're going to be done with questions from my Word file. Sorry if I didn't get to your question. You're watching or listening to this, but if it's from the Nest Discord, I'll try and answer it there via text. So hey,
Yeah.
you will not be abandoned. In the meanwhile, I do love a live question. Is there anybody in the chat right now with a final question that we can quickly rattle through, or are we going to call it a day for this and do a little spiel and say goodbye? I'm going to do a timer. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Dunzo. Okay, no questions from the chat. So I guess that means we've answered everything anyone could ever possibly want to know. So I will wrap this up by restating that the Beating Hearts and Battle Axis Anthology crowdfund is still going. It is going to wrap up noon or a little bit later because you have back hit overtime where if somebody pledges in the last 10 minutes, then another 10 minutes gets added to the timer, right? And as long
Yes.
as that keeps happening. So who knows
Yeah.
if that'll happen this time? I don't know. But but yeah, it ends at noon EST, Saturday, July 20th. And right now we're doing okay. We're like I haven't looked at the count in the last few minutes, obviously, but I think we're somewhere around 400 or a little under $400 from achieving our big art stretch goal, sextuple art. You see what I did there, sextuple? Eh.
Yes.
No, Shay, let me explain. There's this thing people do sometimes. Anyway, and so the nice thing about that is that means we'll go from just having one sort of title page illustration for the whole anthology that would go kind of just inside to instead having 6 illustrations, one for each story, a full page, all by Trevor Ninja. And I think that will be lovely to have. So let's hope we
It
hit
would
it.
be
We
very,
have
very
1 week to
good.
go. I think we could. I think we could. If you want that to happen, please pledge, or if you already have, please tell your friends, tell your book club, tell your online community, wherever it is that you think would be into this thing, to give it a whirl. Because hey, you can do the digital; it's not too pricey. Or if you want to, you can get yourself a nice mass market paperback, classic size, or luxurious hardcover. You got options. And he said at the end of the hour talking about editing, we
Yes.
have a tier with limited pledges, 3, 2 of which are already claimed, so there's only 1 left,
Yes.
to have your short story developmentally edited by Jay. So, something
Yes.
to consider. All right. Thank you all for watching, for listening, whether you did it live or later on recording. You're all special to me. And also, if you see this video or hear this as in podcast format or whatever after the crowdfund is over, hey, don't worry about it. Go to newedgeswordandsorcery.com and there'll be a link to either the post-campaign pre-orders, which don't have crowdfund goodies. That's why you want to get in the crowdfund, or eventually retail sale. So, one way or another, you can follow this trail to the book. All right.
Yes.
Again, thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Jay, for giving me some time on your morning. I know the two of us, I'm the morning person, so I appreciate you.
We
making
have
that
to. We
effort.
have to be operating on diametric poles. It's all good.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, the trick I'm finding these days is to have a smooth-haired fox terrier that will not sleep past 6. So,
Yeah, I don't
alright.
have that problem.
It is a problem. I love Polly. Oh my god. All right. Well,
All right.
good night, everybody. And by good night, I
Take care.
mean good day.
Good
Who
night.
knows? Bye.